Hello and welcome to 2024 end of year list. Some of you may have seen on the website and on the label side of things, we haven't really been focused too much on new music. Reviews have been sparse, and we've been mainly focusing on getting reissues out. So now I wanted to do a kind of a bigger list to really go through quite a few bands that marked me in positive ways. Right, there's been a lot of good stuff this year. It feels like the kind of post-COVID wave of creativity kind of died out last year. But then this year, something else has picked up, and there's some really, really good releases that came out, and some that are even canonical. So let's get it started. Alright, so starting us off is Hanging Entrails, and their debut EP, What a Life. So this is from False Hope Records, who are a small American label, specialized in kind of a lot of noise and electronics and, some pretty raw BM. But what makes this actually stand out compared to a lot of raw BM is that, where a lot of raw BM tends to focus more on these kind of spontaneous bursts of noise, with the occasional guitar riff and, sometimes a scream or two there that is more, in line with what's going on in those fields rather than black metal. Hanging Entrails actually uses that kind of raw black metal sound as a base for a lot of sound experimentation. Starting off, for example, the most noticeable thing, which are the vocals. They're heavily processed and distorted with a lot of reverb, a lot of echo, when they end up sounding more like sirens, than an actual individual screaming or whatever. And, this is coupled with some really creative use of synths, very bright, completely out of the regular for this kind of music. But, it all kind of creates this very dense and, suffocating atmosphere, right? But, that wouldn't mean much without the riffs. And for the most part, the riffs and the melodies, they stick to a lot of the kind of Iljon idea of very simple riffs. Black metal has always been the genre where, sometimes less is, well, more often than not, less is more. And Iljon is that methodology pushed to its extreme. So this takes those kind of Iljon riffs and, it plays around with a lot of post-punk and goth melodies on top. So, this ends up being a really interesting combination that is all centered around this singular mood that runs for around 20 minutes, and it never feels with those influences, you would automatically associate this with like, post-black, black gaze, whatever Wolves in the Throne Room is, all that stuff. But no, this is really black metal with those influences and not some kind of pastiche that only uses the textural and wallpaper elements of black metal. So really interesting debut. Shame about the programmed drums. Obviously, I think this is a fairly young band and they quite haven't mastered, how to use programmed drums and the amount of possibilities that could open them up. But as far as, raw black metal debuts go, this is one is really good. So next up we have Ulcerate, Cutting the Throat of God. So this album, really sticks to the ideas of, set out on Stare into Death and Be Still, and doesn't really seem to be, too interested in changing that, right? On the website, you have Raf's review that really perfectly explains this, right? Where he compares this to kind of, throwing ink into water, that makes beautiful changing shapes that disappear after a while, and that is essentially how this band have always worked, and this is just another continuation of that with a few differences. First of all, the melodic post-rock bass that was introduced on the slowly throughout the years has been pushed to its limit here. So for the first time ever, there is a bass for which everything revolves around. But apart from a few harsh rhythmic changes and some and the interplay between the chaos and the clean guitar parts. You know what to expect, right, with this band. Also, the production is the best that it's ever been here. The individual performances are absolutely outstanding. It's a really respectable album. Ultimately, it's just a collage of individual and ephemeral moods, more so than any collection of songs. And I think, the band could use with a bit of change, but still, it's a very respectable entry by, one of the pioneers of this subgenre. Now we have Apokatastasis, the Withering of the Disconsolate. A little warning here. There may be a bit of bias, as Malice, the main man behind the project, has released an album through the Hessian firm label, and is a frequent collaborator on the podcasts. But I genuinely did enjoy this, so I'll try to explain my reasons for why I like this without going, without trying to be too biased or whatever it is, and try to have a sense of neutrality. So first up, compared to the consecutory Secretion, this is in many ways a hard fork from it, and as well as a progression. So a hard fork in the sense that the previous album was brutal death metal majoritarily, and this goes to more of an early Gothenburg sound, right? So thinking the second At the Gates album with Fear I Kiss the Burning Darkness, and the first two Eucharist albums, Velvet Creation and Mirror Worlds, which really seem to be the base for this. So this works better for Apokatastasis and Malice in general in many ways, because Apokatastasis is at its heart very emotional music, and that early Gothenburg sound was perfect at expressing ecstasy and a lot of strong feelings, both positive and negative ecstasy, and all sorts of feelings, and really running the gauntlet in a way that's quite similar to black metal more than, typical death metal. First up, he does this style quite well because, one of the major issues that this style has is that it sometimes tends to get a bit too saccharine, and it tends to, in the search of the grandiose, the epic, the catchy, tends to leave behind the aggression of what makes metal, and it does tend to become a bit wallpaperish, because all you hear are melodies on top of melodies, and you need something, you need a bit of meat, right, and not just sugar. So this does that really well. The melodies themselves, while they are within that kind of mold, it's just the way they are harmonized and the occasional use of counterpoint, which really makes them stand apart. Malice is really good at crafting these melodies, making, separate guitar lines that interact in really interesting ways. So it's really well, done on that point. But there are a few problems this album has, First of all, it's, because Apokatastasis is so ambitious, he does try to go towards kind of atonality and serialism, and unfortunately those parts do fall flat, because they tend to sound very out of tune, out of place, and in the worst of cases just like a bunch of random notes vomited on top of these really cool riffs. And that's a real drawback, especially on the latter half of the album, where a lot of these parts get too much attention. But that's the issue with young one-man band bands in general. But I think that if either those parts can be kind of relegated or used more sparingly, and really kind of refined quite a bit, that, you know, there is something that could be done with that mixture. But for now, you know, this remains a very good album. It's great to see that progress. It's great to see, you know, artists that we are associated with progress like that. And, you know, and I hope it just keeps getting better and better. Now we have Crucifier's Led Astray, you know, which, as many of you would know, is the brainchild of ex-Grand Belial Key's drummer, vocalist Kaz Grant. And, you know, this is quite a little bit of a different style, but there are a few similarities here and there. So this takes a lot of the kind of reverb, atmospheric elements of Thy Sulphur Throne on High, and pushes those to the extreme. So the way a lot of this album works is that, you know, it's within that kind of old, you know, early USBM style, you know, which sees black metal more so as a form of death metal rather than, you know, what was going on in Europe. And so what it does, this actually slows down that tempo, which a lot of that, you know, subgenre runs on, and unironically gives the weight, you know, the melodies and the riffs a lot more weight, because now they have more time to kind of develop, to do things, and they're run through this heavy metal filter, but not heavy metal from the the early 80s and mid 80s bands, but really more so how it was utilized by the late 80s death thrash black whatever kind of melange that was you know, dominating extreme metal at the time. And that's really cool because it gives it so much energy, you know. So you're going to have these, for example, very simple, you know, down-picked power chord riff, but it's going to be cut up with a lot of these kind of short, heavy metal fills, right? Very high octane, in your face. You know, they're not harmonizing these little melodies. They're not basing the songs around them. You know, it's not like the Troopers chorus, for example, by Iron Maiden or whatever. You know, they're just really there just to give a lot more energy to those riffs. You know, well, something else that is really well done here as well, Spencer Madman Murphy's solos that really are given time to shine in this kind of epic way. And though he's not a shredder, he's very, very good at finding these melodies that fit, you know, in this kind of narrative within a narrative way, and that do what a good guitar solo should do, which is, you know, embolden the riffs, you know, give the riff more potency, really highlight the chord progression, and, you know, show off, you know, how good the riffs are. And he does that while telling his own story within the song at the same time. And, you know, it's not really done with this style, because this style kind of, you know, goes the noise way, the death metal way, or, you know, the bestial black metal way, but never really in that kind of, you know, looks back towards the 80s. And so, you know, Crucifier don't reinvent the wheel in any shape or form. They're not doing something that's insanely original, but it's done so well that it just ends up coming up as being, you know, stronger than the sum of its individual parts. Now for some classic heavy metal with Sol Anahata's Syncretic Sovereignty. Though Judas Priest released a pretty good album, this year, Invincible Shield, it's pretty much the same. It takes off from their, mid-80s stuff and does that style pretty well without really adding anything new to it except for like an Ozzy Osbourne vocal part. But here, in general, I always felt that, heavy metal was a dead genre when it did not take from extreme metal. I believe Atlantean Codex really revived the genre by taking more, from the long, epic compositions of Bathory's Viking period and, applying it to a more standard heavy doom context. And so Syncretic Sovereignty does that, but to a very light extent, right? It's not like, Painkiller taking a lot from Slayer, for example, and, Judas Priest arguably making their best album in 1990. But here, the black metal influences are kept really light, and they're mainly used to kind of push everything to its limit. This isn't basic heavy metal in the traditional sense that, a lot of these new wave traditional heavy metal bands are trying to do. It's not revival or anything. This is just people who really love heavy metal and really enjoy certain aspects of black metal and just kind of combine them together. And, it does kind of, does work as a sort of counter movement to the new wave of traditional heavy metal because, first of all, the production is very pristine. Everything is taken extremely seriously. There is, there is no irony or self-deprecation. All the individual performances are great, tight, on time, which changes a lot from that kind of style. And, doesn't, and while obviously it's very anthemic, it doesn't rely on the kind of, bang your head kind of, elements that a lot of these bands do. First of all, when it comes to this kind of music, is that these bands tend to live and die based on the strength of their vocalist. And Ian Tello is a very good singer. He's not trying to kind of, hit his upper range. He sticks mainly to this very bellowed baritone voice in the vein of more someone like Matt Barlow rather than Bruce Dickinson. But, when needed, especially for a lot of these choruses where they need, he needs to go higher, he is capable of doing it really well. He maintains full control. He doesn't strain himself. And that just makes a lot of those vocal melodies upon which this album is so dependent that much stronger. And, from time to time, he is capable of, letting out a good scream when, the songs call for a little bit of variety. Structurally speaking, this doesn't really focus on particularly long songs for the most part. There is a few songs that go above the 8-minute mark, but it sticks within the kind of Metallica / power metal framework, which means, okay, you have your verse chorus, with the chorus being your kind of climactic moment that repeats a few times throughout the song. But then, quite a few things can happen throughout that, be it, a new riff, some extended, dual guitar harmonies, a really good guitar solo, whatever. But then it just kind of leads back to the choruses, and this works because, once again, the choruses are really captivating. And obviously that, they are epic, but not in a way that tries to be more epic than it actually is. It just sticks to good, solid melodies where they're, very busy, but everything comes together and it just works. There are the occasional, orchestral passages which are kept, luckily pretty sparse for the most part. And that just kind of, just gives a little bit more variety to these riffs, because it's all based on the kind of heavy metal language that we all know and for the most part, adore. But the band are just really trying to take those ideas and push it to the limit. And, they're really trying to sound more empowered and intense, more so than grandiose or, imagining themselves rock stars in a stadium. And, ultimately this works more so via the band's intention, just as much as, more through the band's intention rather than purely through the compositions, and because that intention really does guide how everything is structured and how all the compositions are made, and it just works. It's definitely my heavy metal recommendation album of the year. Not the most original release, but because it does everything that the 80s bands wanted to do, and it takes that into this era without falling into trying to resuscitate a dead corpse, but just really doing their own thing within those preset rules, and then experimenting a bit out of that. They come up with something that's actually really worth quite a few repeated listens. So definitely, the best heavy metal release this year. Alright, so time for another bias warning. Obviously, this is Polemicist, a band who we've worked with extensively in the past. And, to this day, we do still have, a few CDs and vinyl from them. But, I try, not to let my enjoyment get in the way of things, and try to be as neutral as I can. So this is an EP, self-titled EP, funnily enough, which, takes a detour from, the previous one. So, the first album, Zarathustrian Impressions, was this complete emotional outburst. The second one, Return of the Sophist, was very retrospective. And here, this EP is more of a call to action. This is definitely the band that are most proactive, a lot more dynamic than they've ever been. And they do this through certain, counterintuitive ways. They eschew a lot of the independent guitar interplay that define their style for a much more kind of return to, what the band themselves, well, most people would call, vampire black metal. But they never betray their melodic sensibilities, they're not trying to be Darkthrone. They're just taking in more of that kind of general guideline. So the first thing to know is that, the band don't really rely on, just having both guitars play one line, despite the kind of the interplay disappearing a lot. But it's more so like they'll have a general, one guitar will have an idea and the other one harmonizes with it in a really interesting way. And it reinforces this notion of a singular idea, but within the Polemicist style, right? And they're really, really returning to this idea that, the riff is king. For example, Amongst the Ruins, perfectly highlights this, with a very strong tremolo picked melody that still retains the kind of very esoteric sounding style that this band are known for, but with the harmony is just kind of pushed to its extreme, and, both guitars are essentially working on different shades of a singular idea. And, funnily enough, what makes this EP their most dynamic is how streamlined it is compared to previous releases. Each song focuses on a handful of riff. New drummer Elijah Losh is very blast heavy, but he allows, he has quite a bit of variety, and that stops for the band from, ever falling into a lull. The biggest shame here is that it's only an EP, and, this band, even here, they do have quite a lot of ideas, despite how simple these songs are compared to their previous releases. And I believe an album format would have allowed them to fully express those ideas. But it is what it is, and Polemicist have always been a unique band that can only sound like Polemicist and no one else really. So another great release from these guys. And now for a complete surprise. Well, I would never have imagined, just even minutes before listening to this album, that we would ever have a Caverncore band on an end of year list. But here we are, Pneuma Hagion from Beyond. It's always seemed that incantation and immolation's influence on death metal in the last few years could only lead to the most boring and contrived projects in existence, right? On top of that, we are surrounded by themes of eldritch horrors and Lovecraft, by people who haven't even read the books at this point, and who are just essentially taking their lyrics from other bands' lyrics and so on and so forth until we get the same, two ideas expressed by 500 bands. But somehow this Texan band Pneuma Hagion manages to use all those elements to make something that genuinely stands on its own two legs without sounding tired and derivative. So first of all, it does seem that this band actually do understand their influences and what made those ideas effective once upon a time. Secondly, everything is extremely concise, no song runs over 3 minutes, and the album is less than 25 minutes total. And thirdly, this doesn't try to sound like 90s production. This is great. It's production-wise, it's very similar to Gateways to Annihilation by Morbid Angel, where everything is super bassy yet audible, and this is what it does, and it just sounds great for the idea that the band are going for. Compositionally, this is very, very simple. Because everything's so concise, there is no fat whatsoever. It's even, it just really gives those ideas a lot more potency, because, generally, shorter songs go well with simpler ideas, and, a lot of bands do tend to forget that. So the kind of meat and potatoes of this album is, two separate riff types. You have your breakdowns within that kind of early 90s style, and then you have your classic tremolo-picked riffs, right? So the tremolo-picked riffs work because there's a lot of internal movement up and down, the neck. It's not just kind of finding the easiest chromatic or standard dissonant patterns. There is quite a bit of movement, and that keeps things kind of exciting and always moving forwards, as well as these little random tempo changes that occur throughout, and how instead of there being a strict dichotomy between the tremolo-picked parts and the breakdowns, they just kind of tend to, pop up in between each other, in and around each other, like almost not randomly, but in a really exciting and unexpected way. So this momentum is always kept up, There are no sluggish crawls, no atmospheric breakdowns, no long arpeggiated passages. No, everything is just either fast breakdown, fast tremolo pick drift, and just constantly bouncing off of each other and, using that energy. And, and as soon as the band, the song has kind of like fulfilled its purpose, it just ends. There is no build up to an ending. There is nothing. It's just explore these two ideas in conjunction with each other and then end the song. And it works really well. Lyrically, they somehow managed to make, good lyrics out of these very cliche and tired tropes. So instead of, focusing on people going mad and, oh no, big monster in the sky, it's more so imagining these monsters giving out imperatives, barking out orders to humans and promising them rewards, or, punishing those who do not worship them. And it just works out well because everything is so simple and concise, which is the album's main strength. They're really, really good at crafting their world, from tools that have been used multiple times, but they figured out the formula, which is essentially cutting everything down to its essentials and not letting things, not basking in any moment, just kind of going through your ideas, cutting them up in interesting ways, and that's it. And so, this is the best Caverncore I've heard in a long time, by far. next up we have Ingurgitating Oblivion, Ontology of Nought. Sven did a really good interview, one of the Hessian Scrum episodes, with the main man, Florian Engelke. So I do recommend watching that if you are really interested in, a lot of the background of this album. So, extreme metal in the last few years, especially on the more kind of almost mainstream side, has suffered from a lot of overt pretension that it couldn't quite live up to, especially within the kind of avant-garde and prog genres. Because, there was always this kind of need to justify, oh wait, I listen to the smart kind of metal. This is the kind of metal that makes me feel intelligent, right? And, it got to the point where a lot of these pseudo-intellectual projects were being featured in The Guardian, which is a kind of middle-class British newspaper, all right? Which is, well, it's full of pseudo stuff, pseudo-intellectual stuff, and this one kind of falls into it as well. But, imagine if such a project was made by someone who's an actual intellectual, to someone who knows how to make good, simple metal, and then apply those ideas to a much larger scale. Ontology of Nought is that result, Florian is someone who has a genuine love for extreme metal, he still listens to Abominations of Desolation 30 years on and all that. But there's this also deeply kind of German, mid to late 90s German death metal thing where they all seem to love, jazz fusion, especially I'm thinking of the works of Mahavishnu Orchestra and the main man John McLaughlin, right? And there's a reason for that. It's a very deep rabbit hole that has a lot of interesting twists and turns, and that would be more suited for an entire episode just for that. And here, so the way they use the jazz, right, which is compared to like more overt expressions, is that they really integrate the kind of jazz chords within a death metal riff structure. So for the most part here, a lot of the riffs at their base are somewhat standard death metal riffs, but then they are kind of supplemented with these jazz chords and really kind of just stretched out. So you get this very interesting jazzy touch, but it doesn't lose the effectiveness and, the aggression of death metal. So one other important thing as well is Lily Gruber's drumming. He will be someone that we'll talk about quite a bit further along. He just adds so much variety, his fills are crazy. He is capable of playing multiple styles, because one of the most important aspects of this album is that it's not only a metal album, it's also an ambient album and a jazz fusion album, and a kind of weird mix of all these things where the really long song structures are justified by just the mastery the band has on all these styles and how important they are to each song's narrative, right? So a lot of the death metal parts would not work without the jazz fusion parts. To take a, random tech death band, sometimes when they put these jazz fusion parts, it really offers a respite, here's a little breather, you can relax. But here, it's just as important as the death metal. The ambient parts, the haunting female vocals that come, towards the second half of the album are just as integral to this as are the growls and the various shrieks that go along here. And so it works. So this makes it is a very difficult album to listen to in its entirety. That I'll admit. There's so much going on a macro and a micro scale. But if you are capable of kind of sitting with it and really absorbing it, and possibly grouping this, each major song and then stopping there, then you'll find that this is really one of the rare albums that can achieve, that does achieve everything its scope promises. now we have Aldridge's For Death and Glory to the Gods I Cry. So Aldridge is the brainchild of OWGA, who is mainly known for working in a folk-influenced Graveland style. But For Death and Glory to the Gods I Cry mostly circumvents this in favor of high-speed melodic black metal with touches of death and heavy metal, somewhat similar to Sorin or The Section in concept, but it's still grounded within that pagan black metal style, despite circumventing a lot of its main elements, so to speak. So this album, for one, it almost constantly operates at breakneck speeds, and the transfer of momentum between each of these riffs is fantastic. As while the melodic language doesn't break any boundaries, as it sticks to a combination of minor and harmonic minor scales, and these have been done to death within the genre, but the sparse use of keys on the more important parts gives them a sense of identity, as well as just the kind of just how much energy and how much keeps going on, more so than the uniqueness of each individual riff. It really does function on as a sort of kind of like if one were to imagine waves, and you're just kind of keeping the momentum of that wave going until it crashes to the shore, and not letting it die out before it crashes. So riff wise, Aldridge does stick to a pre-established riff shape and language. You're not gonna you have your kind of very typical speed metal alternate picked low strings with the kind of quick 2-note chords coming on top to as a tail. You have your tremolo picked riffs. It's nothing like insane, but it's just the little melodies that they cut everything up with that really keeps things like exciting, and it almost feels not random, but they tend to come on like the offbeat. So you'll have a tremolo pick part, and then it'll just halfway through the riff, it will just break up into a little melody, and then before going back to the tremolo picking. And things like these are really what give this album its own identity. And of course, some of the songs have these fantastic climaxes on on a more structural level, where OWGA will just go into these incredibly dexterous guitar parts that just add that just really approach almost tech death levels of wizardry. And because there's such a build up to it, it generally does feel cathartic in this case, and it's incredible how he does it. But if this album does run at 42 minutes, and if it was 42 minutes of consistently fast black metal, that would be tiring. But luckily these are countered by ideas from previous projects like Albionic Hermeticism and the previous Aldridge album, where you have these beautiful folk melodies that wind down the songs, and then they generally use at the end, and it gives them this really kind of heartfelt conclusion, because the folk parts are just as good as the this black metal parts. A lot more kind of obviously a lot slower, but then a lot denser harmonically. There's a lot more harmonies. There's more more guitars, some acoustic guitars. It just really is well done, and it offers some fantastic respite. And it who would have thought that high speed black metal and folk would go together, but they do somehow. Thematically speaking, the lyrics are really well researched for this kind of project, and it's not just, oh, the Christians took our land, oh, they forced us into their religion, oh, we'll never give up. No, there are some ideas like the Battle of Stamford Bridge, which is generally regarded as the end of the Viking era, as Harold Godwinson of England defeated Harold Hardrada, the Dane, and then only to supposedly get shot in the eye by an arrow at the hands of William the Conqueror himself about 3 weeks later. And there are also tales, like fictionalized tales of pre-Roman Britain, that really do show a lot of familiarity with that time period. And it's really interesting. Good lyrics can always help an album, achieve a higher level. They can't save a bad album, but they can always help a good album. And and it's funny because despite the initial aesthetics and everything that OWGA has done in the past, Old Ridge completely destroys that, in terms of technical and compositional proficiency, because the stuff he does on the drums and the bass as well, not quite as mind-boggling as what he does on the guitar, but still incredibly impressive that one man is capable to play all these instruments at such a high level within this idiosyncratic style that just fits the band. And, I genuinely do believe that if, this pagan black metal subgenre wants to continue, this is the inspiration that will blow, fresh air into its rotting corpse and reanimate it. Fantastic album. Alright, so now we have Mefitis. Obviously there's going to be maybe some bias, but then again, I've been singing the praises of this band since at least 2019. And their new album, the Skorian / the Greyleer, won't change that yet. So essentially this is, a kind of compilation of 2 EPs from different sessions on one album. The first side being the most traditionally metal of the two, while the second one really escapes such confines. The most important part of the production is that both sides were recorded to tape, which was a very difficult limitation for a band that likes to load its music with a lot of subtle details, and that's always had a big focus on sound design, especially on off-scourings, and even to a lesser extent Emberdawn, where, a lot of pings, a lot of not random, but short moments of percussion, a lot of multi-layered voices, and so on and so forth. But but the way they managed to make it work, because it's, for such a maximalist band, right? The production is incredibly warm, yet a lot of these details here are very easily noticeable. I do believe that some may, at this point, may have gone over my head for now, but then, like a lot of good albums, you discover things as you listen to them more and more. And but yeah, so in terms of subtle details, it's going to be more so on how they layer certain melodies rather than the extra musical elements that they like to add in. So here, structurally, there's a lot more of an emphasis on big refrains, that function like loudly proclaimed exclamation marks within these, within their kind of labyrinthine songs, right? And the clean vocals are used quite a lot here, and they're really, really good in kind of emphasizing those parts. They offer some fantastic melodies here and there. And, it works really, really well because it gives an element of simplicity. It gives you something to latch onto within these very complex songs. And, it just makes everything sound, larger than life. So really good use of clean vocals, and obviously I'd like more in the future from these guys. So the 2 songs really that impressed me the most, Withering and the Greyleer, especially the second part. Because, this is a band who's obviously their melodic sensibilities did come from bands like Demigod, At the Gates, Dissection, Sacramentum, etc. But at this point, they've pushed them so far along that it almost becomes foreign to metal in a certain way, and it does approach a lot of post-punk, which obviously, these guys have always really been into. And not in the way that, when a lot of bands change genre and become, something else. But no, but this is just like a lot of these ideas and these metal sensibilities have been pushed in that kind of direction, by constantly kind of refining and working around with these melodies and, adapting them for their own taste. So it's great to see how much they've done and how much they've kind of, gone from Emberdawn to here. Especially, with the Greyleer being such a departure for these guys, but still having all these noticeable elements that existed on all their previous works, even on the single before Emberdawn. But yeah, so it's this is another incredible release from a band, that has an immeasurable number of tools at their disposal. And yet they still stick to their own voice. And, the puzzle is coming along, every album, tells its own story within the kind of common world, unified world of Skoria and they kind of unified musical language. But each album really explores a certain part of that. And I believe the Skorian, the Greyleer is a fantastic representation of that. And this is a band that, quite honestly, they had an incredible debut, but they still managed to find a way to keep getting better and better. And, now we have, it feels like it was yesterday, and now that Emberdawn came out, and now we have 3 albums. So always great to hear these guys. Now, as many of you would have guessed, based on my review in December, this is by far my number 1 album this year. Defeated Sanity's Chronicles of Lunacy. It's a canonical release, like I said in my review. It would have been highly regarded, even if it came out during death metal's heydays. In 30 years of existence, and in about 22 years of those last 30 years, Defeated Sanity were and are to this day the most important death metal band in existence. And somehow, against all odds, they made what is probably their finest album. The free album rule doesn't apply to them. They never tried to sell out or replicate past successes. But this isn't their most ambitious or groundbreaking release, with that honor belongs to their previous one, The Sanguinary Impetus, right? That managed to push back the boundaries of death metal by quite a bit. And, that's a video / article for another time that, will require immense amounts of research. But what they did here, which is really interesting, very few bands have ever done this that I can think of, is they've reevaluated their previous periods and their past successes, right? So, their first period, that was a lot more classic death metal in the vein of early Gorguts and Suffocation, the more slamming Psalms of the Moribund, and even, the death-inspired Dharmata. And what the band did here, they figured out a way to combine all of those disparate ideas within a very coherent framework, as each song flows perfectly. And it's all tied down by Lily Gruber's incredible drumming, who just somehow manages to get better and better over the years. Even when the band, revisit a simple bread and butter, mid-paced autopsy riff, right? Lily's drumming just takes it to another level. He completely changes the feel of that riff. He keeps getting better with more and more complex ideas. But he also now knows how to incorporate really simple and distinguishable grooves, by the way he lets his snare ping and all that, the weird cymbal sounds. It's just incredible the way everything he does. It's such a multifaceted drummer whose drumming works on multiple levels, you know. And you take into account the almost kind of meterless parts of their music, the sudden tempo changes mid-riff. And, you know, despite the complexity of everything, it just works. Because there is still that kind of innately caveman-esque groove that just drives everything forwards, right? And, you know, and even with his insane drumming and the time that he must have spent for that, you know, he's still the main songwriter on guitar for this, you know, for this band, which is just absolutely mind-blowing, right? And, you know, even with the complexities and the really low-tuned guitars and the very bassy sound, the production is absolutely perfect, especially in the digital age. You know, people have really started to figure out production. You know, I've said this in a few previous bands, that we are now finally starting to understand how to make metal in the digital age and to give it a level of, you know, production that is just as on par as the stuff in the 90s, right? You know, everything here is, you know, really low, deep rumbling, but even the bass is incredibly audible, and it never sounds too pristine. You know, it has that brutality, and somehow it's all very easy to understand. You know, there is a lot to dissect here, and, you know, I can't really get into it. There's just so much. But all I'm going to say, you know, this is a canonical album. It's a must listen. It's really one of the truly great albums that came out in the last, you know, 20, 25 years. And unlike a lot of, you know, other great albums that have come out in more modern times, right? This doesn't close off a specific part of that subgenre. You know, this really leaves the door open for a lot more ideas within the future. So yeah, in conclusion, I do believe that 2024 is a landmark year, you know, for metal, and really shows that the genre has a lot of life left in it. You know, there are a lot of other good releases that I decided to omit just because I didn't feel that they were quite on the same level as these ones, or that they had certain faults that were a bit too hard to ignore. But, you know, overall, I do believe that, you know, 2024 sees a remarkable step up in the quality of metal. You know, the production problem is starting to get solved. A lot of bands are sounding better than they ever have, you know, even this late into their careers. There aren't any particular innovations I've come across, or that, you know, that sound like, you know, metal can go into new, weirder places, or that, you know, the canon can continue as it went from like heavy to thrash to death to black, whatever. But, you know, those things aren't necessary. You know, as long as good music that comes out and that has its own voice, and you know, if metal continues at this rate, you know, the sky's the limit, right? This genre, you know, I still do believe, I've always believed that it has untapped potential, that we have not seen the best of metal yet. And, you know, this year, hopefully, is a prequel to what will happen within the next decade or so, hopefully. So thanks very much for watching. If you stayed this long, feel free to argue in the comments if I forgot anything, or if you believe that some stuff wasn't there. And, you know, hopefully we'll be back for other videos more often this year.